out near King Lake, just in some fairly tall forests. The area was burnt in 2009. I'm Phil Zylstra. I'm working at the moment as an Adjunct Associate Professor at Curtin University. I'm a fire behaviour modeller. I've come into that from a background in fire management and remote area firefighting. And so what I've tried to do is work on solutions to issues that I saw while I was in management, and issues that had come up in firefighting where it seemed that management was not necessarily making it easier to control fires and was potentially making a more flammable landscape. And so what I try to do is understand how fire affects the flammability of landscapes in a long-term sense, based off the responses of vegetation, and that can vary from one side of a hill to another based on the species of plants that are growing there, and soil types and all sorts of factors along those lines. What you don't want is a crown fire. They're obviously completely uncontrollable. They have the highest impact on biodiversity or protection of human lives or property. Crown fires also have a disproportionate effect beyond just the area being burnt. Because you've got trees burning, you've no longer got that overstory shelter. The trees are exposed to the full strength of the wind. So the fire is moving as fast as it can move in an active crown fire. And if you've got an unstable atmosphere, then that can produce what are called pyrocumulonimbus clouds, firestorms. They're essentially a thundercloud that's created by the fire, and we've seen a lot of those in recent years. These can have incredible effects, ranging from producing lightning that can spark new fires. In Canberra in 2003, a pyro cloud caused a tornado on the outside of the town. They override any natural controls in the landscape because they promote such intense spotting events. They're carrying embers through a hot air body, keeping them alight for long distances, and you're getting very long distance spotting. You can jump past natural obstacles in the landscape. Taller saplings that you can see in the background here, as they get older, they become less and less likely to ignite. Those taller saplings will slow the wind beneath them as well as the canopy. If that canopy is tall enough to be out of reach of the flames, then you don't get a crown fire. You'd be unlikely to get a crown fire in a forest this tall. That height of the canopy is really critical in the consideration, because a tall enough canopy prevents crown fire, and it also slows that wind and slows the fire underneath it, so there's time to get resources in front and time to control it, and also the fire doesn't get as far in the landscape before something like a change in the weather might bring it under control. Two options we have are to either burn the forest or to allow it to continue aging. And if we allow it to continue aging, what we'll see is the saplings will get taller. They will begin to self-thin. They'll self-prune their lower branches, so they'll become less and less likely to act as ladder fuels and carry fire into the canopy. And as they self-thin, they will also continue to become taller trees, and we'll get a denser canopy than we have now. Potentially a double layered canopy where we've got a sub-canopy of tall saplings and perhaps other trees like blackwoods and hazel pomaderus and things like that. That will then reduce the fire spread beneath them significantly, and it will also mean that the roots from those plants and the shading from those plants will outcompete smaller plants growing beneath them. We'll see a thinning of the bracken eventually, and a thinning of other dense plants on the ground, and a much more open understory, and a reduction in that overall fuel hazard score. Of course, none of that is fireproof. There's always a situation where something can burn, but it's a matter of the odds of it happening. And the greater these forests The more time these forests are allowed to mature and develop these ecological controls, then the greater the control they have on fire. And you switch from a landscape that we have now, which is dominated by recently burnt forest, recently disturbed forest with little patches of old, into a landscape dominated by old forests where lightning fires start and go out by themselves and minimise the amount of fire in the landscape. And this is why Australia has so many fire-sensitive species that thrived long before we got here. Each time we disturb a forest, we're removing tall plants that act as overstory shelter. They will be replaced by short plants that act as fuel, and so we create a pulse of flammable landscape there, and that pulse will pass. So just taking a momentary snapshot and saying this has a greater than high overall fuel hazard can be misleading, because it may be that the best thing is to allow it to continue aging so that you get essentially a permanent reduction in that fuel hazard score afterwards as the forest naturally progresses and ages. If we burn it, on the other hand, we reset the clock, and we're stuck in that very short time span because that fuel hazard comes back very quickly again, and we're left with continually burning it. One of the most potent key threatening processes in Australia at the moment is increased fire frequency. We are losing species left and right as a result of this. So there's no sense conducting a burn where you can't put people. If you conduct a burn in a remote area, the fire will burn through it. The Black Summer fires burnt through New South Wales, for example, where New South Wales National Parks had doubled the amount of prescribed burning compared to the preceding decade. It was more prescribed burning than they had ever conducted before in National Parks history, and yet the Black Summer fires followed that period. And it's very, very hard to point to a prescribed burn where you can definitely say that helped to contain the fire. Almost invariably you see situations where burns were either just burnt straight across or even hindered firefighting efforts because they were trying to light a back burn in an area that had been prescribed burn just a couple of years before, and it's quite hard to get a back burn going there. So prescribed burns may be useful if they are conducted next to a trail where someone is prepared to put their trucks and prepared to trust that that prescribed burn will calm the fire enough. If you're not prepared to do that, then don't do the prescribed burn. What you're doing is resetting the clock with this. Let that forest age and let it get to an age of essentially permanent reduced flammability, permanent until the next disturbance. And then you create an overall less flammable landscape. A remote, broad hectare burn produces an area where you might have 3, maybe 4 years of very slightly reduced risk that you can't really take advantage of because you've got no firefighters there, followed by several decades of greatly increased risk until that pulse dies back down again. So if it's remote, just let it develop the way it did for millions of years before we were here.